Okay, welcome everyone. We'll get started here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Emily. I'm a program manager for the DataWorks initiative at FASEB, and I'm excited to host this salon and talk about how we can make our research data accessible and not just available. And this is going to be particularly important when you're thinking about preparing data for publication or submission to a repository. We've got a great speaker from Dryad, Laura Bowman, who's one of their senior data curators, who will speak about the process, what you can do, and some common mistakes that we see from the side of data curators so that you can avoid those and make your data submission process seamless and as useful as possible. Before we go into that, I'm going to give a brief presentation about the DataWorks initiative and some of the ways that we're trying to support the research community and people like you in learning about data sharing and reuse and using it in your own research practice. So FASEB DataWorks. FASEB DataWorks is a program of FASEB, which is an organization that is a federation of biomedical and biological research societies representing over 100,000 researchers across the US. And DataWorks as a program has two main goals. We're really here to link researchers to services and expertise so that they can learn about and use and harness the power of data sharing and reuse in their work, and also bringing together partners to improve this ecosystem. We know that the capacities for using and understanding and leveraging data in research are growing and improving every day. And part of our goal is to bring people together to talk about where the ecosystem is now and also how we can integrate and create connections across the ecosystem to support data sharing and reuse. So we're excited you're here, and part of that linking is our monthly Salon program. We also operate a prize, which creates incentives and recognizes and rewards people who are using data sharing and reuse for use data sharing and reuse to advance biomedical research. We also have a help desk, which is a place where you can find resources related to best practices in data sharing and reuse in biomedical and biological research, and also some very accessible and easy to use guides to help you as you think about data management practices and how to learn things like complying with the NIH data management policy. Before we jump into the presentation itself, I do want to take a minute to celebrate the 7 teams who were just recognized as part of the DataWorks Prize. You can meet them at the website herox.com/dataworks. Some of those winning teams are part of, will be part of a symposium later in the year. And we're excited to celebrate not just the really innovative work that they've done with data sharing and reuse, but also the impact that it can have on the community who can learn from and understand the work that they've done and think about how it might apply to your own research. I also want to highlight that we have a help desk, as I mentioned, which has many resources which can support you to learn both data sharing, data management, and data reuse practices. And with that, we'll jump right into Laura Bowman and how we can make our research data accessible and not just available. So Laura, I'm going to turn it over to you, and really excited to hear from you. After Laura's talk, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for presentation or for question and answer, where you can ask your questions either in the chat on Zoom or raise your hand and ask them live. So thank you, and here's Laura to talk about making your research data accessible and not just available.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Can we see the slides?
Looking great. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Definitely let me know if there's, if at some point you can't see it or if there's any sort of issues. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me on Valentine's Day, whether you celebrate or not. So as Emily said, today we're going to talk about how to make your research data accessible, not just available. And I'll get into what the difference between those two things are. So first, I'm Laura Bowman, as she said. I'm a senior data curator at Dryad. I've been at Dryad for about a year, and I will talk about Dryad in a second in case you don't know what we are. My background, my first master's degree is in accounting. I was an auditor for 10 years before I switched and got my master's in library and information science. And I took the track of data librarianship, so research data management. I worked for Penn State for a little bit and then moved on to Dryad. So that's kind of the background that's relevant. I have been curating data sets at Dryad for over a year now. So I've seen some things, and that's where this presentation is kind of an amalgamation of all the things I've seen. What is Dryad? Dryad is an open data platform and community for publishing research data across all research domains. So basically, we're a generalist repository with a lot of built-in community aspects as well. Generalist repository means we take all kinds of data, all kinds of disciplines, anything that doesn't have a specialist home elsewhere, we can take. All of our data sets are curated. Every single one of them before they're published is checked by someone on our team. And we check them to meet the criteria for FAIR, one of librarians' favorite acronyms, which means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So really making sure it is as usable as possible once it is shared. And you may know, especially if we have biologists in the audience, I'm sure NIH, NSF are a lot of the funders for your research, and we do meet the criteria for acceptable repositories for both of those and most other agencies that fund research. We've been around since 2008, and right now we have over 50,000 data sets available on our site. If you go to data.dryad.org, you are able to see all the published data sets. You can download them today, any that you want. They are not under a license, so they're all public domain data, and you don't even need to log in. So it's very accessible and easy to get data from Dryad. And finally, we're a member of the GRAY initiative, which I think is an important thing to note, and I will explain that. So GRAY is the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative. And basically it is a grouping of all of these generalist repositories. I'm sure some of them look familiar to you, hopefully. Zenodo and Figshare, really big players in this space. And so even though we're kind of working in the same type of thing, we are working together to make data as good as possible. So the mission for GRAY is to establish a common set of cohesive and consistent capabilities, services, metrics, and social infrastructure across all these repositories to make sure that we're providing the best product possible. The other thing that GRAY does is raise general awareness and help researchers to adopt FAIR principles. So we're one of the big players in this GRAY initiative, which I think is really exciting. So let's get into the bulk of the presentation. These are the learning objectives for today. So first, we're just going to kind of set the stage, talk about context, big picture of data sharing, and then the main part of the presentation will be about documentation. Super, super important part of sharing your data, and the distinction between accessible and available data, which I'll get into. And then finally, we'll wrap up with what I've called hiccups, because I couldn't think of a better word. If you have a better one, let me know for next time. And these are just kind of common problems that we see with data sets that come in, why we have to contact the author to update their data sets, which causes a delay in getting your data shared publicly. Let's get into it. Context, my favorite word. I always need some context before I do anything, so that's why we've started with that today. So first, let me talk about the difference between accessible and available so that we have that context. Available, you have data, you have put your data as you've last used it on the internet. It doesn't have any documentation attached to it, so technically it is available to anyone. But can they use it without understanding the organization, structure, or how to use the data? No, not really. And I'm sure in your career, you've grabbed someone else's data, either to reproduce results or a meta-analysis, and it was just kind of gobbledygook, and you couldn't understand it because it didn't have proper documentation. And that is the difference between making it accessible. Is it actually usable in the form that it's shared in? So first, I just wanted to go over kind of some reasons why you would want to make it accessible, why it helps you and science in general. So the first thing I want to point out is the golden rule. Share data with others as you would like data shared with you. It's a good thing to take a step back and kind of think of this. As I said, you've probably grabbed someone else's data at some point in your career, and maybe there were some issues with it. So make sure that when you are sharing data, you're doing it in a way that you would want it to be shared with you. The second point is to enable different forms of reuse. This one I think is really important and something that people don't think about initially. So, you know, we talk to a lot of researchers that use the data from our repository. A lot of them are pedagogical reasons. They are statistics professors that need their students to grab random data from the internet to practice methods or to do data visualization or something like that. So it could be used in a context that you were not expecting. There's also, you know, it could be used by someone who's relatively new to the field or interdisciplinary, who is not quite as familiar with your discipline as you are. And so explaining it as best as you can is helpful. And the final one is, you know, new technology is created all the time, and there may be a use case in the future that you can't even fathom right now. And the goal of data sharing with preservation in mind is that, you know, in 10 years, when some sort of technology that I can't even think of is available, you'd be able to look back and use your data that you shared in 2024, and it's still usable at that point. And that kind of goes into ensuring long-term sustainability. Sometimes researchers who prepared part of it are no longer at the university. PIs are not always available upon request. And also, honestly, for you, I don't know about you, I don't know what I had for lunch yesterday. So when I go back to something that I did a year ago, I might have no recollection of what I did. And so it's good to document all this stuff for yourself as well. And so one of the main points, if you take away something from this presentation, it's this: to take a step back from your own data and view it as an outsider. This might seem simple, but I think it's a really helpful step when you're trying to figure out what to document, because generally when someone else pulls your data, they will have never seen it before. And that's why you need to provide the context that helps someone to, you know, figure out what's going on in your data set and how to use it so that it is actually accessible. For example, as a data curator, I've never seen these data before when I go through them to curate them. So having documentation that explains what's going on, how everything fits together, the organization, is absolutely critical for me to be able to figure out if everything is there. So as I said, a big part of this will be documentation, because that is exactly how you make your data set accessible, or at least a big part of it. And as I already said, without proper documentation, your data may be available, but it's not necessarily accessible, right? Because no one knows how to use what has been published or uploaded or whatever. So there's a couple pieces to documentation. So first, there's basic metadata. And for those who might not know, metadata just means data about the data. So it describes the data that is your actual research data. And I put these separately here as the first point, because these things are usually collected as part of the repository's required fields. At Dryad, these are things that we have to collect before you can even submit a data set to us. So they include the title of the data set, which helps with findability. So make sure it's something you would want people to search, find your data set. Authors or contributors and their affiliations. An abstract. Again, you want some context as to what this data is, and a brief abstract really helps to kind of set the stage for what people are looking at. Keywords, again, findability, people being able to search for thing that they're looking for, especially with meta-analyses if they're doing those. And then related works. This includes a DOI of your article, published article. Generally, a lot of data sets underlie the conclusions in a manuscript or article. So it's important to link the data set to the article so that people know that they belong together. And a DOI is just like a persistent identifier that will always go to your article, in case you have never heard that term before. So the second piece of documentation at Dryad, we call that a ReadMe, and I will go into more detail what we mean and why we use that word. But I do want to point out, for the purposes of this presentation, that you don't have to have a document called a ReadMe. You can call it what you want. Sometimes people call it metadata. Basically, you just need some documentation of all the things that I'm going to talk about, and it could come in various different forms. So it doesn't have to be a ReadMe, although if you do publish with Dryad, we do require one. But I'll explain what that means. So when I say ReadMe, you may think of software or code. That's kind of the origin of that term. And so a ReadMe, I think they're required on GitHub, for instance, if you publish code there, has instructions for configuration of the code, installation, any bugs, troubleshooting, the change log, anything you would need to know about the code to run it, right? So the data version is the same concept, just translated to data. So you're going to have the context for your data. Again, my favorite word. The folder and file list of what you have uploaded. This is kind of like the map to your data. Metadata about the data collection, and we'll get into what that means in a bit. And any instructions for accessing, analyzing, and reusing the data. So same concept, just explains what you need to know to utilize the data. And I will be saying ReadMe throughout this presentation because that's what we call it at Dryad. But again, just to be clear, it just has to be some sort of document included with your data set so that people have all this information to make it accessible. So what I've done today is broken that up into 4 categories of information to include in your ReadMe to at least think about. They might not all be applicable, but this is just kind of giving you some ideas of things to think about depending on the type of data that you have. So first we'll go over dataset organization, and then the dataset metadata, data specific context, and any use or reuse instructions. And we'll go through each of these in detail. So first we have dataset organization. As I mentioned, previously when talking about a README, file and folder list. This is super important and something that gets missed a lot because I think sometimes researchers might assume the data is there, someone can see what's in it if they just, look at the downloaded data set. What's important about this file folder list is two things. As I said, it's kind of a map as to what's in the data set. So a lot of times it's important for people to be able to see what's in there before they download the data set, especially if it's, over 50 gigabytes. You want to know what you're getting before you commit all of that space and time to downloading it. And second of all, it helps the user to know that they have successfully gotten the whole data set. It lets them know that 100% has been downloaded or they have it correctly. In addition to listing the files and folders, it's very important that there's a description of all of that. The listing is important itself, but again, this is the context that someone would need to kind of understand the data set. They've never seen your data set before, and they need to kind of have the scaffolding of how to think about everything. So it's important to give a brief description. In addition to that, any file relationships. Some files depend on other ones. This is especially relevant if you have code in your data set and it needs some inputs that are in the data set and, kind of what folders feed into other ones. And so some quick tips about this section is that all unique files or sets of homogeneous files should have a clear description of the contents or function. This probably feels like a lot of work depending on what your data set looks like, but it's critical to making it accessible. For large data sets that have a lot of hierarchical folders, file trees are a really good way to depict that in a README or other documentation. You can generate a file tree through the command line of most operating systems, just again to show the structure, exactly how the data set is laid out. And then for homogeneous directories that maybe have outputs from some instrument or, they're all the same, just different samples, you describe file naming conventions so that based on what is in the name of the file, users will know what that contains already. And I'll give you an example of that to make it more clear on this page. So these are some examples of what these would look like in a README or other documentation. So first we have unique files, file name, brief description of it. So we have a nexus file, it's just morphological character matrix and where it came from. CSV file, this one actually lists out the columns and units and all that stuff, which we will talk about in a minute more directly. These folders with uniform sets of files, this is when you have a series of repetitive files. You just have to describe the directory as a whole. And so, you have one TPS file for each sampled species numbered sequentially. You already know what each file is going to contain, and that's all you need to write. And then this is what I was talking about with naming conventions. This is typically what they look like when you write down a naming convention. You'll have, the date, observer initials, species, sex, and the image number, so that you don't have to write any more details in the README. Users already know what each file is going to contain based on how it's named. This is really something important to remember for repetitive files. I'll go to dataset metadata. So this is kind of how you collected the data and other points about it that aren't directly talking about the data itself, like describing the data, but about how you generated it and gathered it, where it came from, all of that type of thing. So this is info about collection and processing of the data, sources of the data if it wasn't generated by your team, other points of access to the data if you happen to have stuff in GenBank or NCBI. And then license or copyright considerations. And I'll talk about that a little on the next slide with the example. But basically, this would be any sort of filtering that you did or pre-processing that you did to the data to get it in the form that it is shared if it's not totally raw, or any modifications. This might be the geography of where you collected it, when you collected the data, the sources that it came from. It's from another data set that you pulled and worked on. You would cite that. Any information on the instrumentation used, if it is something that you collected from instruments, what model, the calibrations that were on the instrument, anything like that, that would be necessary for someone to recreate the analysis. And I will say this stuff is very important to think about, especially in a generalist repository, because we take all kinds of data, so we don't know necessarily, or we don't have required fields for these types of things because every data set is totally different. So it's important that you think through what you would need to know about the data to use it if you were an external party to your research. So again, these are just some examples for modification. Data were downloaded from a database and duplicates were omitted. Weight and height data were randomly jittered to ensure anonymity, just so that people know what they did in case they try to recreate it and can't quite get those same data. This is, the place where the samples were collected, the time period. This is some information about instrumentation and the settings that it was on. And then for license and copyright, this part is notably very confusing for everyone, I think, because there are so many licenses out there. Generally, data is put under a Creative Commons license. CC BY is fairly common, which just means the data needs attribution to be reused. So Dryad actually publishes all its data with a CC0 license waiver, which is essentially putting things in the public domain. But it's just important when you're publishing data to know what license you're putting it under and to include that in the README if it's not front and center on the repository page, just so that everyone knows exactly how they're able to reuse your data. Now we'll go to data-specific context. This is my favorite part. And this is stuff about the data that will help you. I mean, it's all to help you use and access the data, but this one is specifically describing your data. So this includes a variable listing and description. Just listing the variables is not super helpful, but describing each of them is super helpful. And part of describing them is including units of measurements, very important, and scoring keys, categorical variable possible values, anything that would help to, decipher what the actual data points are. And then I do want to call out this missing data or empty blank cells. This is something that we run into a lot while I'm curating, especially. So if there are, and this obviously applies mostly to tabular data, people won't know what the empty cells are unless you specify that in the README. It might be missing data that someone forgot to enter in there. It got deleted accidentally. It could be that no information is available. It could be that the sample, something happened to the sample and it was ruined. Whatever the case may be, it's extremely important to include that information. Though it's very obvious to you what happened and why there's not data there, it won't be to the user unless you specify it. And finally, defining abbreviations and acronyms. And I'll just repeat what this tips side says here. Please don't assume that units of measure are universal. I can tell you from a year of curating general data from all over the place, they are not universal. I always ask for authors to provide units, and I think you might be surprised at the variety of answers I get when they do put them in. Likewise, I know when you're really in your research, the abbreviations are second nature and acronyms that you might use, but they are also not universal, and they might not be common knowledge. Could be a new grad student, someone outside your discipline, someone from a different country, and it's different terminology. It's just always best to be explicit so there's no ambiguity about what your data means. So again, this is just kind of an example of tabular data in a CSV file, describing each column heading, units, what it is, and possible values for categorical variables. For the NA or blank cells, you just say that the element was too incomplete to be measured or estimated. Some people know it's not missing, there was something wrong with it. And I want to call out this last point because this happens when people submit data in formats that do allow formatting. So Excel, for example, maybe not the best for preservation purposes, but if you do happen to have data that's in Excel, putting highlighting or other formatting in it, you really need to call that out in the README, because if someone imports that data into R to work with it, for example, they lose all that information. Also good for accessibility purposes for people that are using screen readers or other devices, to make sure that you know what that highlighting indicates. And if it doesn't indicate anything important, please remove it from your data set. People will ask you what it means. Finally, reuse instructions. This is very key to making your data accessible. This is any programs you need to open file types, different file types, software libraries, the version of those libraries that was used to do the analysis that you did, and any overview of the workflow or processing steps. Again, this is really important with code. Do you need to set a working directory? The files need to be set up in a certain way for the code to work as it is written. The tips for these, please, in making your data accessible, avoid listing only expensive proprietary software. Putting data freely available that requires a $10,000 license to open isn't really freely available. Likewise, when you have operating system exclusive program, it limits the reuse potential of that data. So, make sure to include freely available software when possible as alternatives to open the data. As a curator, I am pretty aware of a lot of these programs, and most do exist for file types that do come from proprietary software. Again, provide the versions of the software and libraries that you used, because it's not always the most updated one that has been used in the data, and any special instructions needed to handle the data. This is an example of what some of those would look like. A list of R packages and their versions of what was used so that people can recreate the analysis. This MATLAB one is a good example of having a freely available alternative. So MAT files can be opened in MATLAB or Octave, which is freely downloadable, Mac, Windows, Linux, all of those. And then this one can be opened in Flojo, which I think might be a paid software, or using a special package in R. And then for workflow, this is one that we run into a lot. If it's a very big data set that's been GNU split, not really sure how I say it, need to be recombined in a special way to actually be able to unpack it correctly, it's good to just include those instructions for people that might not be as aware of how those work. And to at least say that it is split that way, so people don't try to unpack each file individually, which doesn't work. I've done that. That was a lot. Like I said, those are things to think about as you're going through the data set. And like I started in the beginning, if you take a step back and pretend that you've never seen your data before, what do you need to know to use it again? That's what you want to include. These are just some kind of things to help you think through what you need to include in your data set. It might not be all of them. It might be all of them. And including this as early as possible in your data collection generation phase is key, because you might forget by the time you have to actually submit to a repository. So the last section I've called hiccups. As I said, I couldn't think of anything better, but these are things that we see often that cause delays in the publication process. And so just an FYI, please avoid these if possible. And these are reasons that we send back to authors that we've seen over and over again. The first one is blanket descriptions of directories, folders. You get a lot of data sets that say, this is it folder has my data. That's not extremely useful, unfortunately. These are both real examples that we have. That's not doing anything, really. And I know it's a lot of work to describe what's inside, but it's very important to make your data accessible. So please take the little bit of extra time to describe all your unique files or sets of files. Listing the variables, but not defining them, and forgetting units. This is extremely common, I think, because researchers are so close to their own data. They know what all of it means, so it doesn't occur to them to include it, but it is extremely important. I see a lot of data sets that say columns are height, weight, something I made up, and day. I don't know what units height or weight in. I have no idea what that third one is. And day of what? They know, but I don't know. So make sure that you include it. Inaccessible file types. This can kind of mean two different things. First one is putting data in a format that is not really usable for that type of data. And by this, I mean tabular data that should be in CSV, for example, TSV, something like that, but it's submitted in a Word document table or a table in a PDF. That is very hard to reuse in any way, shape, or form, because you'd have to copy and paste it into something tabular. So just think about what the best way for someone to use that data would be. And again, this can also be files that are only open with proprietary software. I will say that if sometimes the proprietary software retains more detail or has more capabilities with the file type that it creates, and so often you can upload those as long as it's also exported to a format that's more easily accessible for other people that might not have that software. Last two or three. Referring out to external sources for basic documentation. Now, the point of putting your data onto a repository that's set up for preservation is that it is out there in perpetuity, or at least, a decade or so. And you want everything to be self-contained in that data set. So a lot of times we'll have people say definition of variables are from this other website that lists them out. That's fine for right now, but we don't know that that website's going to exist in 6 months, 1 year, 10 years. It's important to copy that information and actually include it in your submission so that everything is available in the same package and you're not worrying about other external sites being preserved. This happens with bioclim variables a lot. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with those, but we get a lot of link outs to describe those often that we have to ask them to put in their documentation themselves. That's one of my personal pet peeves. Unreadable formatting. It might be easiest to describe all your column headings in one long paragraph, but that is not easiest for someone else to read and kind of cross-check with the file. Bullet points, carriage returns are your friend. Bold some things. Make sure that it's actually a readable document when you're done. It's more likely that people will use it and read through it. And the no formatting here is that people submit without any formatting at all. So ours are in Markdown. Our ReadMes are in the Markdown format, which does allow some formatting. Some might be HTML. So you can bold, italicize bullet points, something like that, just to make sure that you're able to actually gather information from it and it's not one big block of text. And finally, licensing issues. Basically, the gist of this one is you must know what license you are publishing your data under. Once you know that, you need to know what license other data you have used from elsewhere, what that was published under. And you need to make sure that the one you're publishing under isn't looser than the other one, because you can accidentally invalidate someone else's license. So for example, someone publishes under Creative Commons BY, which means CC BY, which means people have to attribute the use of the data to that author by law. If you publish under CC0, which is putting it in the public domain, you are entering that other researcher's data into the public domain without their permission. So when you are pulling data from elsewhere, it's just important to know what that's under and what you're publishing under to make sure there's not a conflict and that they're actually compatible. That was a lot. But I will open it up for questions. There's some QR codes there for the Dryad website in case you're interested. We also have a post on good data practices. And then my email address, if you have any questions you don't want to ask right now, you're curious about something, please feel free to email me.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. You really gave a great overview of some of the things we can think about. And as you said, putting our data in the shoes of others and thinking about how would they understand it and giving that context and metadata to make it really as useful as possible. We do have 2 questions in the chat, and I encourage folks to put them in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question live. The first one is around some free alternatives to opening files generated by proprietary software. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about this and or spaces that we could dig in to get an answer for that one.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head what Leica software is. Prism, I know we use one that has, I think, a Z in it for the Prism. Honestly, I know I'm not like a robust science background myself, so we internally have a document that's about 160 pages long with how to open different file types.
Yeah.
This is just a problem that we have every day. I can definitely look and see if we have any ones, but I would think experts in the field would probably know better what specific alternatives there are, or I always Google it first.
Yeah, I think that this highlights maybe one of the things that you were mentioning in terms of all of the proprietary software and how you can really consider if the data that you're submitting is truly accessible if it's using some of those softwares. And as you mentioned, those softwares change and access changes as they're either acquired or shifted or upgraded. So I think we'll put a pin in that one and think about the second question from Anna Waller here, which is, where do you suggest reporting funding source? Whether there's a way to identify the project so that you can link the data sets and see them over time. So yeah, I'm curious how Dryad does that and maybe some of the best practices you imagine for that.
Yeah, so it will depend on repository for sure. Dryad does have a field for that. So linked data is becoming a huge thing right now, and it's kind of, I don't want to say maybe it's a toddler stage where it exists, but it's not quite flushed out yet. So part of what we do at Dryad is try to make these persistent identifiers, we call them. So like a DOI or anything that like a number attached to certain entities. We do link like all of author affiliations. There's a database called ROAR, which has like an identifier for each university or funding source, for example. And we do link those so that they are consistent. Every data set funded by NIH, for example, in Dryad is linked to NIH. It's in the metadata of the data set that's how it's funded. So theoretically, you could run a report for every NIH funded data set. The reason I say it's in its toddler phase is that I don't think like you couldn't go from the NIH website and see all of the Dryad data sets that are linked. It's not quite linked both ways yet. I think that's kind of in process. If it's not a required field in the repository that you're posting to, I would encourage you to include it in the README or other documentation. But that's a last resort if you can't somehow link it to a persistent identifier in the repository itself.
Yeah, I think we were discussing having a salon just on this topic itself of linking data sets both across different repositories and across sort of versioning and the history of a project. And then we have a sort of follow-up here around balancing being readily openable and losing the metadata, and where we can think about that. What are your suggestions when you kind of think about how to bring metadata through the life of a file and some of the ways that it might get brought into different contexts?
Yeah, I mean, this obviously very much depends on the type of metadata that's being generated. I assume this is like things that come out of an instrument that might
Microscopy,
kind of spit out all of that stuff. So also forgive me because I don't know anything specific about microscopy, but
sure.
I've seen some systems have, you know, like a parameters file that gets spit out, or you can generate that from the original data as a text file or a JSON file or something. So including that with the data set with the more readily available format is good. If there is a way to kind of export that metadata in any way, you could include that in your README, or like I said, just an extra file. And that's why I think it's good to include the proprietary format in your data set as well as an accessible alternative, because, you know, the gist is to make your data available to everyone and kind of level the playing field as much as possible with people who want to utilize this data. And like I said, sometimes you don't know the use case for it in the future. It's just good to kind of cover all of your options. I also do want to say that when, you know, I think I mentioned to include your abstract and kind of stuff that might be in your manuscript with the data set. I forgot to mention this earlier. The reason that we ask for that, or we recommend doing that, is sometimes articles are paywalled, and that's a barrier for someone to be able to understand certain things. Not that the article needs to be duplicated in your data set, but the things that are absolutely necessary to understand it, we recommend you include in the metadata so that it's all together, because you don't know, you know, what might happen in 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I see some great contributions from Sun-Young Kim around making the case for people to be able to open data, but also thinking about standard formats. And it's going to be that balance, especially as we see the ecosystem changing, the standards, and a lot of the tools moving towards a more consolidated view of how they collect that metadata and then align with some of the standards across the field. So it's always moving, but I think that when we think about really making as robust as possible those README and metadata part of the submission, it really will help with having quality submissions that are easier to both be accepted and also be used by others.
Yeah. And we totally acknowledge that these proprietary softwares have extra functions, and, you know, there's a reason they cost $10,000 a year or what have you. So I'm not trying to discount that those files are very important. Of course, it's just trying to make sure that we serve as many people as possible.
Yeah. We do have time for maybe one more question here, and then we'll wrap up this conversation. Really appreciate audience engagement, and this is a space to have conversations about things like data accessibility and where we're at. So part of this is learning, and part of this is talking together as part of a community. So I'll leave some space for any more questions.
And again, if you think of something later, I don't know if the slides are shared anywhere. Okay.
Yeah, we'll make those available. All right. Yeah. I'll just wrap things up here then. I really appreciate everybody joining us for this February Salon. And there are a few ways that you can continue to keep learning with DataWorks, and things that I'll highlight as part of our program. The first is that you can continue learning both on YouTube. We'll be posting this video as well as our prior salons, so that you can come back to this, refer to it, and also through our newsletter, which you can sign up for at FASEB.org/DataWorks. This is a monthly space where you can learn about what's happening in DataWorks, and also get access to things like the recordings of this event. We also, as I said, have a help desk, which is a space for you to learn from and get access to both information about best practices like we talked about today with data and data management, but also step-by-step guides on what to do next. The next salon will be on March 20th, where we'll be talking about how you can select a data repository that fits the needs of your research project.